Good evening. Thank you. I want to start off by advertising our YouTube channel one more time. If you go on to YouTube and type in Newland Street Church of Christ, you can find the page there. And I know it's really small, so you're not going to be able to see how many subscribers we have, but it's a really tiny number, okay? We have way more members than we have subscribers. So you know what that means? It means there's a lot of members who haven't subscribed yet. So we need you to do that. It would be very helpful for us to reach more people. And it's very simple to do. You don't have to pay money. You don't have to do anything like that. If you have a Facebook account, I think you can log into YouTube with your Facebook account. So you don't even have to make a new account. Just go to YouTube and make an account or use your account that's there through Facebook or Google and hit the subscribe button. There are several videos that we have on there. All of our Bible classes, this Mark series, all of it is online and can be found there. So if you need to catch up on anything, and once we've completed the Mark series, it'll all be there and it'll stay there so you can go back to it if necessary. Also, there's the video series that I've been putting together on the four Gospels. And I think it's a very good series. I'm very proud of it. I don't know how to express it. I don't mean to sound prideful or arrogant, but I think it's very useful material and I want you guys to see it. And so if there's any of our members who haven't seen it, I want to make sure you watch that because it's some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight is in more detail in the video series. So go ahead and please go to our YouTube channel and hit that subscribe button. It'll help us reach more people. Okay. As we've been going through the book of Mark's gospel account, we've been seeing several themes over and over again. The main themes are these two questions that are here on the screen. Who is Jesus and what does it look like to follow him? And we've talked so much about this, but here we are kind of drawing to a close to our class. If things go according to plan, next week will be our final class in Mark. You're surprised by this, Richard, but that's if things go according to plan. So next week should be our final one, meaning that a lot of these themes are reaching a crescendo. And I think we're certainly going to see that tonight in the crucifixion of Jesus. That some of these big important themes that we've been just repeating and talking about so much are coming to a head. And one of those themes, this who is Jesus idea, that question is answered all the way back in the very first verse, in Mark chapter 1, verse 1, where we're told that Jesus he's given two titles in that verse. Can somebody tell me what two titles he's given in Mark 1:1?
Christ, the Son of God.
The Christ, the Son of God. And both of these titles are important for the book and continue to be repeated they continue to get repeated as this book continues on. So it starts there in the very first verse, and then we go into Act 1, as we've seen and talked about, where the question, who is Jesus, is explored, where you have all of these people wondering, who is this guy? Because he's burst onto the scene, and he is performing miracles, and he is a traveling preacher, and he's doing amazing things, and everybody in the crowds, and even the disciples, have no idea who he is. They say, who is this man? And that question is continually repeated until finally, almost halfway through the book, we get into Act 2, and that it starts with a quick story where Jesus heals a blind man in 2 stages, and we've talked about that. Hopefully you remember that conversation. But immediately after Jesus heals this blind man, Jesus then turns to his disciples in the next story, and he asks them, who do you say that I am? So the question has been explored in Act 1, who is Jesus? Then he turns the question on the disciples, and they answer, the Christ. It's a good answer. They're correct. But in the very next story, we see Peter rebuking Jesus, because Jesus, once they've come to that knowledge that he is the Christ, once they kind of realize who he is, he can then start taking them on this journey of understanding, showing them what it means to be the Christ. What does it mean to be the Christ? It means to be the suffering servant found in Isaiah 53. And that's why Jesus turns to them and says, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to die. I'm going to be mocked, I'm going to be arrested. He tells them all of the details, and they do not like it. They don't understand it. They refuse to understand it. Peter even rebukes Jesus. And this is where we kind of get into Act 2, which we've talked about. It's the journey to Jerusalem. And on this journey, and all of these different stories that take place on the road, Jesus is getting his disciples to understand that the Messiah is not who they expected. They expected a great warrior king. They expected someone to come in and just kick out all the Roman armies and establish an earthly kingdom that would reign forever. Jesus isn't doing any of those things. He's warning them as they're on their way to Jerusalem, I'm going to die. And they don't get it. They don't understand. And then we get into Act 3, which is when they arrive in Jerusalem. And we've been in Act 3 for several weeks now. But it's here in the crucifixion that it all comes to a crescendo. That this theme, this idea of who is Jesus? What does it mean that he is the Christ? What does it mean that he's the Son of God? Because again, there's two titles we've been given. And then what does it look like to follow him? Because if Jesus is suffering, if his purpose in coming to this earth was to suffer, then why would we think that as his followers, we would somehow be immune to suffering? And I think this is one of the main points of this whole gospel account, is talking to these first century Roman audience and saying, hey, you're going to suffer in his footsteps, and there's glory in it because you're glorifying God when you suffer for his sake. And that's exactly what Jesus did, and we're going to see it tonight. Hopefully, you guys remember all of that. It'll come back here at the tail end of class tonight. So let's talk about the actual crucifixion. If you haven't already, go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15, and we're going to start in verse 21 in just a few moments. But I want us to talk about just all of the general details that come out on the cross. And because this crucifixion moment is, of course, in all four of the Gospels, as it should be. It is, let's say, the most important moment of the Gospels, that and his resurrection. And there are many details dispersed throughout the Gospel accounts. We know that when they first arrive to Golgotha, and Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh at first. We find this out in Matthew and Mark. And then Jesus is nailed to the cross and risen up between two thieves. And then he says a few statements. Do you remember how many statements Jesus makes on the cross? 7. 7 magic, no, not magic, but you know what I mean. Special number in the Bible. 7. He says 7 statements. The first one we believe, we don't know the exact chronological order, but we believe the first one is found in Luke, where he says, as they're nailing him, Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing. Luke purposefully adds this in, whereas the other gospel accounts leave it out. Then you have the soldiers taking Jesus' clothes, and really they cast lots to basically determine who gets to keep the clothes, meaning that they're leaving Jesus either naked or in a loincloth on the cross. I think we often forget that. We like to leave that part out. Jesus is being humiliated in this moment. And people are walking by and they're hurling insults at him. They are abusing him with their words. And alongside all of the people who are walking by hurling insults, you've got two criminals on each cross beside him who are also hurling abuse at him. until one of them, at some point, has a change of heart and begs for, really, he chastises the other one, and he asks Jesus for help. And Jesus makes his second statement out of the 7, where he tells this man on the cross, I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise. That's the second statement. Then, a few minutes later, we might think, or it could have been before that moment, we just don't know, but around that time, Jesus then looked down and saw his mother, and he saw John, one of his disciples. And he looked at both of them, and he said, Woman, behold your son, and man, behold your mother. And from that day onward, John took Jesus' mother into his household and took care of her. And then at about 3 p.m., darkness came over the whole land. And Jesus then cried out the next statement, where he's quoting from Psalm 22, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? A little bit later, he cries out his 5th cry, where he says, I thirst. And we find out that some of the people nearby put wine and vinegar on a sponge, and they kind of put it on a staff and give it to Jesus. After he tastes it, he cries out his 6th statement, it is finished. And then finally, he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And it's in this moment that he dismisses his spirit, you might say. It's kind of an interesting thing we don't always focus on, that it's almost like a willful death, where he just decides in that moment, okay, it's finished. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And it says he cried out with a loud cry and gave up his spirit, and he died on the cross. And it was at that exact moment, it seems, that the temple curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. Several other miracles took place. There was an earthquake. Many people who were dead in the graves came up out of the graves and appeared to other people. All of these miracles took place, and here at what I would call the crescendo, right as Jesus dies, one of the soldiers, the centurion, in other words, the guy who was in charge of executing Jesus, watches all of this take place. We don't know which parts he might have witnessed, but he sees all of this take place, and he says, surely this man was the Son of God. Okay, so that's the order of events. Out of the 7 statements, how many does Mark repeat? Do you guys know? Just one. You see, Mark's version of the story, he leaves a lot of these details out. I think, and that's not to say they're unimportant. Of course, we have the other Gospels for the sake of having all of these details. But we also, as I've gone over in the video series, we have 4 Gospels giving 4 different snapshots of the same event for a reason. And I believe there's a reason that Mark emphasizes certain details and leaves out other details. And we're going to get into some of that, and hopefully it will make sense. But in my opinion, there are a couple of possibilities as to why he would leave out a lot of details. But I think the number one possibility, the main reason that Mark does this, is because I believe he's intentionally focusing on the idea that Jesus is being mocked and humiliated and scorned and abused, and yet silently enduring all of it. And all of this would point us back to would point us back to the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. As we've continued to see, Mark emphasized Isaiah quite a bit, and I think he's doing so in the crucifixion, where Jesus says very few things, as Richard pointed out last week. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we're meant to draw into our mind the suffering servant of Isaiah, who silently endures all of these persecutions and hardships. And the fact that all of these other statements are left out really emphasizes or really draws our focus to the one statement that's left in, doesn't it? So we'll look at that as well. But before we do that, I want to ask a couple of questions and get your feedback. So far in the story, who has been mocking Jesus?
Just give me a few, from the last few weeks, as we've seen, who has mocked Jesus so far, and how have they done so?
Soldiers.
Soldiers have.
What do they do?
They spit on him, slapped him, told him to prophesy, did the crown, took lots for his clothing.
Yeah, also.
Physical abuse and verbal abuse. Who else is... They were the ones who did the robe and the crown. Did you have one?
The guards, the temple guards.
Yes.
During the
So we wanted to leave.
Between the two different types of soldiers. And the way I read, Mark, and I kind of said this a few weeks ago, but the way I read it is when his face was covered and they were hitting him and telling him who to prophesy, I read that as the actual Sanhedrin doing it, not just the guards, but that could be an interpretive thing. So we've got the Sanhedrin who definitely mocked him verbally, if not in that way also. We've got two different groups of soldiers. Anybody else?
What about the crowd?
Now, what has happened to Jesus' the popular opinion surrounding Jesus? Why have they shifted so severely? Because they loved him only a week ago, or at least that's what it seemed like. Anybody, any thoughts on that? Why has the opinion shifted?
Well, when Pilate was trying to let him go, the mob mentality, the scribes were stirring up, and they got this mob mentality going that they wanted him crucified. And it's a crazy thing that happens, because it happens today. And it's crazy that people make terrible decisions. Anyways, they got him all riled up to crucify him, and then it's going through.
Yeah. You reminded me of a quote from a movie. A person is smart, but people are stupid, basically. The mob mentality idea, okay? Did you have one?
Hospital, in the past, they saw just how much he could do, and if he could do everything, but when they saw him actually willingly going through all this stuff here and not even trying to defend himself or stop him in any way, they figured, what's going on?
So,
Kind of their expectations are being completely out of sync, yeah.
What he should be or could be doing.
I think
That's
that's
why the disciples ran off. Any other thoughts?
This is really a kind of one of those interpretive things, but in verse 8, this isn't, the way that Mark describes the crowd, it's not the general crowd that was at the temple and Jesus is teaching them. It's a particular group of people who just happened to come into the court at that point in time, who I would guess probably came to ask for the release of Barabbas to begin with. They may not have, they may have just come to ask, but they come, about the Paschal amnesty. And so then Pilate says, okay, who do you want me to release? Mm-hmm. Then, as Tim said, the chief priests and so forth spur them on.
Yeah.
But they don't seem to be just kind of the people that were supporting Jesus the day before.
The chief priests have either been lucky or they have orchestrated who's in the crowd at this moment. And they're definitely, we're told that they've spurred it on. And I think all of these answers combined are kind of the answer to that. Here's another question that I don't think we might not have an answer to. So I'll just throw it out there. If anybody has a thought, feel free to give it. Why did Jesus have to endure so much mockery in addition to enduring a horrific death? Why is the mocking part of the plan, or how is it part of the plan? Any thoughts on that?
Prophecy needs to be fulfilled. I don't know further from that. I don't know where you're going with that one.
I'm not going
With it. It's just a genuine question.
The example that he's setting for us, that what he endured, we're not going to endure anything near that, but we are going to be mocked.
right.
Great point. Jesus is the ultimate example for us. And so the way in which he endures suffering and mocking is an example for us when we endure mocking. That's a good point. And yet,
Yes, it is prophecy. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think with just connecting with what Mike just said, considering the largely Roman audience that Mark is writing to, specifically for them. I know you're asking in a more general sense, but I think for them, I think they do foresee, or they already have, or they will maybe shortly be dealing with Roman authorities, as Jesus is here. And
that's why Mark emphasizes the mocking above some of the other things. And because his audience is going to be dealing with the same types of issues. I agree. All right, without further ado, we're running out of time already. So let's go ahead and go into the text. I know, shocking. Okay, let's look at verses 21 and 22. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. So we have this interesting little addition that as Jesus is being compelled to carry his kind of most likely the crossbeam out of the city up to the place of the skull, it seems like it's too heavy for him to bear. In fact, we're told as much in John. He's been flogged, he's been beaten, he's been up all night. He's having a very difficult time carrying this cross. It shows his humanity. And so they compel someone in the crowd, just this random guy who we're told is from Cyrene, which is an important coastal city in North Africa. He was probably in town for Passover, but the city was too crowded, so he was staying in the country and would go into the city, throughout the day. He was going in for the morning, rituals and Passover and so on. So he just it seems from the account that he's just a random passerby. It's not like he was in the crowd following, what's going on. He just happens to be walking by, going the opposite direction, and they make him carry the cross with Jesus. And what I find striking about that is that this random guy seems to be important later on in the church, or at least an important member of the church. And why would I say that? Well, look at how Mark categorizes him. Look at how Mark distinguishes him. He tells us, man, I gotta move this down, sorry. He tells us in verse 21 that this man, Simon, was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Who are Alexander and Rufus? We don't know, but if you turn to the book of Romans, chapter 16, at the end of Romans chapter 16, when Paul has finished his letter to the Roman church and he's going through kind of personal notes, he mentions someone named Rufus. And the connection between the fact that that letter was written to the Roman church and that Mark seems to have been written in Rome and spoken to the Roman church has made some, and myself included, think that this is the same Rufus. In other words, Simon, this random passersby, this random guy who was compelled to carry the cross with Jesus, somehow or another, his children are now members of the church in Rome. Now, what does that mean to me? Well, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I don't think anything's in the Bible by accident. I think that Rufus is the same Rufus, and therefore, in what seems to be a coincidental moment, this man is brought into a situation that will change his life. We don't know anything else about Simon, except it seems his children were members of the church. So maybe in that interaction with Jesus, he came to believe. That's at least how I choose to look at it. We don't really know. But I do think it's just really cool to think of, not just cool, that's not a big enough word. It's really profound and wonderful that God does work in mysterious ways, and he works through chance meetings and so on. All right, let's go ahead and keep going. Keep reading. Verses 23 through 24. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. I don't know about you, but growing up, anytime I'd read the crucifixion accounts, I would be surprised at how little was written about the actual crucifixion. Sorry? It's just one word. Especially Mark, he says it like that, and then he moves on to all of these other details. And he moves on really, to, as we've talked about, to the mocking, to the examples of those who are hurling abuse at Jesus. I think one of the reasons is because, again, Mark is written to a Roman audience. They've seen crucifixions. They know what this means. They don't have to have the details laid out for them. They know how awful a crucifixion is. Now, it does help us to go over the details because we don't see crucifixions every day like the Romans probably did. So we do need to understand, and I know we've talked about it, and I know most of us here know what that entails. But let me just give you a few details, just so we're sure, so that we're on the same page again. Normally, a condemned man was stripped. And this, again, goes back to the idea that Jesus could have been naked on the cross or in a loincloth. They were then laid on the ground, both arms outstretched across the crossbeam and nailed to the crossbeam. Then the beam was raised and fastened to an upright post, which was already stuck in the ground, and the victim's feet were then nailed to it. And there was usually there was a peg that was partway up the post on which the victim would sit to basically help them last longer, because that was the goal of crucifixions. Let's see how long we can draw out this death and how painful we can make it. Now, most crucifixions ended with the victims having been there for 3 days or so, dying of exhaustion, and going into a coma, and so on. And of course, we know from John's gospel account that in some cases, if they were taking too long to die, you would then break their legs so that they suffocated. A victim's personal belongings became the property of the execution squad. In this case, it seems there were 4 men who were the execution squad of Jesus. And we see them actually casting lots in verse 23. They're unwittingly fulfilling a prophecy in Psalm 22, verse 18. Unbeknownst to them, they are fulfilling something that's been spoken, and we'll read that passage in just a few minutes if we get there. But I just want us to note, and it's an important note, that this isn't Jesus making a decision knowing the prophecy himself and making sure that things happen. This is somebody quote, and I say quote, outside of Jesus' control, who is still fulfilling the prophecy just as it was written. And so this is just further evidence, further proof that this was all meant to happen. This was all meant to be. All right, let's look at verse 25. Any comments or questions so far? I'm seeing a lot of grim faces, and I understand. I understand for sure. Let's look at verse 25. And it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. So this is Mark using, he's actually using Jewish time, which is kind of an interesting little switcheroo, because usually he's, dealing in Roman things. But in this case, he uses Jewish time, whereas John uses Roman time. This is about 9 a.m. So it's 9 in the morning when Jesus is nailed to the cross. Verse 26. In the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Now, it was the Roman custom that they would put the name of a person and the charge, the criminal charge of that person on the top of the cross as they were being crucified, and that's what's taking place here. And of course, we know from the other gospel accounts that Pilate seems to be using this as a way to mock some of the Jewish people, some of the Jewish leaders who brought Jesus to him. Why would that be a mock to them? Do you guys remember in John why they go and complain to Pilate? It's kind of a side detail, but go ahead.
Don't say he's the king of the Jews, but that he claimed to be the king of the Jews.
Yeah.
They do not like this idea that he's being called the king of the Jews. They say he claimed that. And of course, Pilate just says, what I've written, I've written. Why do you think that's a side note. That's going into John. Let's focus on Mark. All right, verses 27 and 28. Let's go ahead and read it. And with him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. Again, we see an emphasis on the mocking. It's the criminals. So Mark leaves out the fact that one of the criminals came to faith. And I think the reason he does that is because he wants the emphasis, again, to be on the mocking. He wants you to feel like Jesus is all by himself. And I think that's the point. Jesus is alone here, and he's surrounded by a swarm of people who are all hurling abuse at him. Now, we know there were a couple of people there near the cross who were on his side from the other gospel accounts. But in Mark, we see the women come out, and we're told they're kind of looking on from a distance. So again, I think we're just meant to view Jesus as alone in the way Mark tells the story. And he's alone in the midst of all of these abuses and all of this humiliation, the likes of which we can't imagine. And I think we so often, when we talk about the crucifixion, we focus on the physical pain, when in reality, that's only like the tip of the iceberg to the pain Jesus felt. I really believe that the emotional turmoil and the spiritual turmoil that he must have felt were tremendous and perhaps worse than the physical pain. Yes?
But sometimes I think that the mocking is coming from Satan because he thought he'd won. So he's through these people, he's just jabbing them again.
I don't think that's way out there.
If you didn't hear her, she says sometimes she thinks that this mocking was coming from Satan himself. And I agree. I think he was definitely there. We know he was in Judas. He was definitely there, and he was definitely behind a lot of the evil. I would definitely agree with that. Any other thoughts? All right, let's look at 31 and 32. So the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. Just all manners, in every direction, every sense that it could happen. Jesus is being mocked in this moment. Of course, they're mocking him here because of his claims to be the Messiah. They're saying, oh, if you're the Christ, you're the Messiah, you're the King of Israel, huh? Then why not save yourself? They even say, he was able to save others. Did I skip that verse? No, I didn't. They say he was able to save others, and they're referencing his healings, these miraculous powers that he showed. And they're saying, oh, he was able to perform miracles. Why can't he save himself now? And what's really ironic is that they're kind of stating some very true statements here, unbeknownst to them. They don't really realize what they're saying. But I think on one hand, they're right in the sense that Jesus can save himself if he wants to, but he's not saving himself, and there's a reason for that. If Jesus were to save himself from the cross, then he would not be rescuing humanity. So it's very ironic that they say, oh, he can save others, but he can't save himself. It's like, don't you get it, guys? he's saving everyone else right now by not saving himself. So anyway, that's kind of the irony that's going on there. And it goes back to one of the themes in Mark chapter 8, when Jesus first talks to the disciples. One second. When he first talks to the disciples about how he's going to die, he tells them, I must die. He says it has to happen. And I think that's continuing on here. Jesus has to die if the world is going to be saved. Yes?
When he is raised from the dead, proving who he was and what he did, all of those mocking gestures become like a megaphone of truth.
Yeah.
If you didn't hear him, he said, oh, now I'm gonna mess it up. Sorry. He said, when Jesus is raised from the dead, all of those mocking gestures become a megaphone of truth. I think basically all of those things that they said are going to get flipped on their head. When Jesus raises from the dead, they're going to be shown that they're false, and Jesus is the one who's kind of shown to be victorious throughout, to anyone who witnesses. Sorry?
Right.
And that's a good point, is that Satan here, he thinks he has won by killing Jesus. But in reality, he's only playing into God's plan. God said to the disciples, I'm going to die. I must die. This is all part of the plan. That's why the prophecies in the Old Testament continue to point to that, where you've got so many prophets talking beforehand about how this is going to happen. And so Satan, he thinks he's making a really good move here by killing Jesus. When, I don't know, it's like a twist ending of a movie, or maybe it's like a good metaphor, but maybe it's like a chess match where somebody thinks they're attacking the other side, the opponent, in a really nice move, and really they're just being kind of led into a trap. And again, it's an imperfect metaphor, but, oh, did you have one? Oh, it's an imperfect metaphor, but I think the idea we need to understand is that Satan thinks he's accomplishing things, and he's not. He's only accomplishing the will of God because God is in full control. Yes?
It does seem Mark is really emphasizing the humanity of Jesus on the cross rather than the being God on the cross, taking all of the ridicule.
Yeah.
The humanity of Jesus is being emphasized here on the cross in Mark's version. Yeah.
Continuing what he did in the wilderness, where he constantly tempted Jesus. And he continues that here with people to try to dilute the truth, so that if we don't believe in what we're seeing, or what they were seeing, and what we see recorded, then Satan wins. He is able to dilute it, and we don't see the Christ for what he was, our Savior. And
and we also
think about how Jesus is being tempted in this moment, I would say by Satan, to come down from the cross, because, and that's where you get into some interesting speculation, but I think it was certainly a temptation for Jesus to save himself. Yeah.
That Jesus telling Peter regarding that Satan has asked to sift him like wheat. And I think that there's just a proof of Satan's influence.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You can't take him out of this moment. All right. I'm going to go ahead and try to I'm not going to make it. All right. I appreciate all the discussion. Let's go ahead and read a couple more verses. We're just going to read to the statement, and then we're going to read what he's referencing, and then we'll just call it a night and continue next week. All right, let's go ahead and read what he says. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, behold, he is calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." That is the crescendo of Mark. Okay, so we're going to really focus on it next week. But I want us to consider the one statement that Mark leaves in here, made by Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me?" We'll talk in more detail about it next week, but I think I'll go ahead and leave you with something to ponder over as the week goes on. And that is that Jesus is quoting from a psalm. So if we go to Psalm 22, Jesus, he is referenced. I encourage everybody to read this whole psalm on your own this week as we come back and talk about it. But I'm going to go ahead and read just a few of the verses in this psalm, which was written hundreds of years before this moment. Just remember that. This is written hundreds of years before Jesus was on the cross. Psalm 22, I'm going to read verses 1 and 2 first, where it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest." And then go down to verses 6 through 8. "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him." Do you notice what they're mocking here? I might have read it a little bit incorrectly. Their mocking is in quotes in verse 8. They're saying, oh, he trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let God deliver him. Now go to verses 14 through 18. He says, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So imagine you're someone standing there watching this. Let's just say you're one of the Jewish leaders, and you have a really good knowledge of the Old Testament. You have a knowledge of what the Psalms say. And Jesus is up on the cross, and people are dividing his clothes at his feet, and they've already pierced him, and they've already mocked him, and people are walking by mocking him in every way you can imagine. And Jesus, while he's up there, quotes this psalm. And you remember the psalm. How would you react if you had an honest heart? Would you realize, all of these things that were written hundreds of years before are now happening before my very eyes? So Jesus, I think on one hand, when Jesus makes this statement, he is trying to draw our attention and the people who are there, their attention back to this psalm, which is a prophecy which foretold this moment. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll talk more about that statement next week. Let's have a prayer. Dear Father, God in heaven, thank you so much for just giving us this amazing moment. I mean, we can't express how profound, how important this moment on the cross is. And we remember it every Sunday. And Lord, I pray that each and every one of us remembers it every day. But as we study it tonight, I hope, Lord, that you have opened our hearts to perhaps something new, that you will lead us in our study of it next week and throughout this week, that we will continue to discover new and beautiful meaning in the moment that saved us. And Lord, thank you so much for that death and for the resurrection that followed. It's in your Son's name that we pray this. Amen.